To customize the appearance of your iLessons or to change the styling of individual components, you can use CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets and is the standard way of how one can customize documents on the web. So if you're already familiar with CSS, this should be very straightforward for you, and we will just cover some of the basic ways of how you can actually use CSS inside of your iLessons. If on the other hand you're new to CSS, don't despair. We will go through the main ways of how we can leverage CSS and how you can actually use it to style your components. While CSS is very powerful and offers lots of different options of how to apply styles to different elements on your page, and also many different properties that we can change, we will cover some of the main ones, and those should be sufficient in maybe 80% of the cases. And then you can consult documentation on the web or tutorials if you run into any situation where those options are not sufficient. Now, the first option we want to talk about is using inline styling. So any IL component has a style attribute that we can apply to it. And the style attribute is expecting an object, so we want to place the double curly braces here, and then inside we want to place a comma-separated list of key value pairs. So key followed by colon followed by the value of that key. And the keys will refer to the different CSS properties, and the values will be the values that we are going to set. Now, to make this more concrete, let's have a look at an example. Here we have this text and we want to change the color of the text. So what we can do is that we can use the style attribute and then we can change the color property here. So as you can see, the editor comes with auto-completion for all these CSS properties. So you can just scroll through them, and they all also come with a description. So you see there are lots of different options, but in this case you want to select the color property and then we set it to the color of your choice. Now, this is the most straightforward way of how we can apply styles to a single IL component on our page. However, this might not be desirable in terms of separation of concerns. So you might want to say, okay, I want to place my styles somewhere else and not in the body of the lesson. Or you might also want to share different styles across multiple components. So there are two other ways of how we can embed CSS rules into our lesson, and we can both use either the style attribute of the preamble or the CSS attribute. They both work in the same way, but like the CSS attribute will actually load a separate file that you can have on your hard disk and that you get just load in. So this is useful if you have several lessons that should all use the same style file. Or you just use the style attribute, which we are going to do for the remainder of this tutorial, and then you just can define styles inline in the preamble. Now, before we define our styles, I want to touch upon two concepts that will be important. The main ones are using IDs or classes. So, when we have an element in our I lesson, we can either assign it a class name or an ID. So if we assign an ID, we just write ID equals and then the name of the or the ID of the element. Now, IDs have to be unique. So if you have several components on your page, you cannot assign them the same ID. So we want to be careful to have each ID only appearing once in your R lesson. However, classes can appear multiple times. So if we want to apply, say, a style to all the headings in our lesson, or to like all specific elements and not only a single one, then we should use class names. And the same idea applies here. We write class name and then we can assign the classes that we want to assign to that element. And bear in mind here that an element can have multiple classes, and those should then be separated by a space. Now, let's put this container here and let's apply some styles to it. For example, we might want to change the background color and also add a border. Now, we give this container, this div element, the class name container, and then we can actually write a CSS rule in our preamble that changes the appearance of that container, or of all container divs on our page. So how does this work? In the style attribute, we need to make it a multi-line string. So we do the vertical pipe here. And then we want to use a dot followed by the class name. And then we put curly braces, and then we put all the different CSS properties that we want to apply. Now, the dot is always to be used if we are using classes. If we want to refer to an ID, we instead use the hash followed by the ID name, and then again curly braces and our list of CSS properties. Now in this case, we had the dot and the container, and then we want to change the background color and then also add a border. Now you can see here that in contrast to the inline styles in the document, where we use this what is called camel case style of referring to the property names, so we have always the uppercase for the first word. We use this style for the properties where we have a dash between them here in this preamble. So that might take a bit of time getting used to, but otherwise, all the properties that you can use in the inline styles, you can also use in the preamble. Now, we have added those two CSS properties, and now they will be added to all the elements of the page that have the class container. Okay, so these are the two main options. Let's also look at one where we use an ID as a CSS selector. So we place this heading in here and we give it an ID, and then we can refer to it also in our preamble. Now, one last option I want to mention is that you can also refer to the different elements by their tags themselves. So this applies to the basic HTML elements that are available, such as divs, spans, or like if you have an unordered or unordered list. So those elements you can refer to in your CSS directly. So for example, the heading elements are h1 to h6, so we can put in those. And if we want to have a CSS rule applied to all these different headings, we can just put them next to each other, separated by commas. So if we have multiple CSS selectors, we can separate them with a comma. So let's do that and change all the headings in our lesson to use a different color, for example. Okay, having seen this, we have now covered several ways of how we can use CSS in our lessons, using inline styles or using the style or CSS preamble fields. If we use those, we want to use CSS selectors, either using class names or like IDs, or just using the different element types, and then we can write our CSS properties and place them inside our rules. So hopefully this gives you an idea of how you can change the appearance of your R lessons to your liking, so that you get the styles that you want, that match your institution, or that are more to your liking than the standard styles that come with IL. Thank you for watching, and in a follow-up video we will look at some of the other options of how you can use the IL editor to build your own IL lessons.